Hello and welcome to this Cascading Style Sheet lecture. This is the agenda for today. We're going to start with explaining what it is and why we have CSS. Then we'll look into the dynamics of it and explain how to actually build a cascading style sheet. We look into some important concepts that you must know and master if you want to be good at it. And then we will look into layout, what is a fixed layout versus a liquid layout, and also explaining about layout grids. We'll look briefly into media queries and why we have them. And you will see that nowadays a design must be a responsive design if you want to target different or multiple screens. So CSS, what and why? CSS is, like I like to say, HTML's beauty case, since it deals with the visual aspect of the HTML, and in other words, the style of it. CSS has been evolving since the beginning of the web. Tim Berners-Lee suggested and supported the idea of separation of concerns, HTML for the structure and CSS for presentation or styling. The current version is CSS 3. The entity deciding and recommending the web standards, like CSS, is the W3C, which stands for the World Wide Web Consortium. Every time CSS grows in features and complexity. Therefore, the W3C has divided the development of CSS into modules, which is basically a categorization of features. That way, a browser does not need to wait for the entire CSS official recommendation, think of it as a book, to start implementing certain features. So, before start styling our skeletal HTML pages, we need to learn the CSS styling code, or the styling language, if you like. It is simple, but you should think inside the box. Like in this example, every HTML element, the header, paragraphs, and even nested elements, is enclosed in its own box. From now on, keep that in mind. Now let's start learning the styling language. We first select the HTML element we want to style. That is called the selector. And then we write the style rules for it, enclosed in curly brackets. Yeah, and that's it. That's simple. CSS is a declarative styling language. Whatever we write between the brackets is called a declaration. And we can trust the browser will do it, as long as we know and write correctly the CSS rules, of course. A CSS rule is a property value pair. In order to write CSS rules, we need to know the predefined properties and give them a value. So let's get to know some CSS rules. And by the way, did you notice you can apply some style to different HTML elements at once? Here we have a plain HTML page, no style attached to it. However, you can see that the browser has rendered the page with some font size and format differences. Can you guess why? Recalling from the HTML lecture that there are semantic tags, well, the browser is trying to make sense of your HTML doc by looking at your type of tags and render accordingly. So the reader can also make a sense of it. So let's add some styling to this doc. On the left side, you see the CSS styling language. We select the body. That's everything we see in the viewport of the browser. And we give 3 different values separated by a comma to the property font family. Yes, you can give different values to certain properties in CSS. This only means that if the first value cannot be applied for some reason, the second will be applied. And if the second cannot be applied, then the third, and so on. Remember, order matters in CSS, and is a relevant issue. You can figure what all the CSS rules are doing to the HTML doc. If you're wondering how to connect the HTML web page with its respective CSS, here is one way of doing it. It is called INLINE. And it uses an HTML elements attribute called style, where you can speed CSS code. Our eagle-eyed readers will have spotted that colors could be given in different forms. Here, for example, you use the RGB channels. There's also an alpha channel for transparency, but it's omitted here. Whereas in the previous slide, the color was expressed as a hexadecimal. And respectively, HTML tag, the head tag, previous tag document. The attribute in the document. Doc S HTML, which is this is the approach, and which allows to design. And finally, the external way of connecting to your style is by using the link tag nested in the head tag of the HTML document. In this link tag, you should define 3 attributes: the href, indicating the location of the CSS document you are trying to connect or link to, the type of the style doc being text/CSS, and the relationship between the HTML doc and its linked CSS, which is a style sheet. This is the approach you should use in your projects from now on. And yeah, here are some reasons. This approach allows to separate the structure from the design completely. And same CSS can be used for every page of a website. Changes to CSS automatically apply to the entire website, and faster download time for subsequent pages since the CSS gets downloaded in the beginning. In order to be productive while styling your HTML pages, you need to write appropriate selectors. Here are basic general ones, but you can go as specific as you wish. Please try yourself by visiting the bibliography located in the end of this presentation. Universal selector applies to all elements in the document. Type selector matches elements names. Class selectors matches an element whose class attribute has a value that matches the one specified after the period. In this case, if an HTML element belongs to a class note, the .note rules will be applied to that element. ID selector, the same as class selector, but matching in this case the ID attribute of an element. We can see here that the cascading word in the CSS acronym is not an accidental thing. If that English word is new to you, I recommend to quickly look it up before you continue with this lecture. Check the rules. We have two CSS rules with the same property color to be applied to the same element I, or the I tag. Cascading means the last rule applies always, unless you type exclamation mark important next to the rule, like in the case below, displaying the B element blue instead of violet and not cascading. But that's because of this important that you write next to the rule. By the way, if you're wondering about what kind of selector is that one, it is called descendant selector. So what about the styling links? First of all, a link could have different states, like visited when the user has visited a link, hover when the user hovers with the mouse on a link, or active when the user actually clicks on the link. You can start with the so-called pseudo classes defined by the colon. And these states giving the user a better experience. When styling lists, example navigation menus in your page, the display rule come in handy to align them properly in a block or inline, like in this example. Border radius property is an example of a CSS3, which rounds the corners of an element's outer border edge. You can set a single radius to make circular corners. The most border radius property you see there is actually, in the WebKit border radius, is browser specific. Otherwise, the property it gets ignored. So you need those depending on the web browser you're targeting. In CSS, there are basic but important concepts that should be understood well in order to design correctly your web pages. Also, it will help you to debug in your CSS. Those concepts are related to the boxes we initially talked about and the positioning of such boxes. So let's talk first about margin, border, and padding. In this graph, the blue portion is where the content of an HTML element goes. The green area is the space between the actual content and the border. That's called padding. The black line is the border itself, and the limits the so-called box. Outside the border, we find the margin. The orange zone in the graph. Thus, you can set these three available properties, padding, border, and margin, to actually change the appearance of a box. For example, you can see here a paragraph with no padding, and after applying the padding rule, you get 10 pixels padding space between the text and the border. You can also, of course, set padding to the preferred size only. Positioning is another key concept in CSS. Most of students' CSS issues have to do with it. A good understanding of box positioning will make a difference in your learning curve. As I already mentioned, CSS treats each element, HTML element, as a box. This box is either a block level or inline. The first starts on a new line. The latter flows in between surrounding text, like the image tag. Containing elements are the parents of the block level elements that sit inside of said containing elements. Recalling from our HTML lecture, a division tag is a very good example of a containing element. Here we observe 3 division tags. Now we can start moving, or better said, positioning our boxes. First, you should know there are different types of positions: static, relative, absolute, and fixed. What you see here is each block level element on top of the next. That is also called the normal flow. This is the default behavior, and you do not need to specify this position. Then we have the relative positioning, which moves an element relative to itself. That means it's its normal flow position. We can see in the example, the paragraph is moving 10 pixels from the top of its normal flow, and its normal flow position, and 20 pixels from the left of its normal flow position. In this other example, the property position of the heading one has been set to absolute 0 pixels from the top and 200 pixels from the left. We see that the box has been taken out of the normal flow, and the other elements act like if box heading 1 does no longer exist, causing box overlapping. That's the effect of absolute position. Fixed position fixes an element to a position in relation to the browser's window. You can see this effect when the user scrolls down. Then you will see that the element gets exactly fixed in a certain position, no matter how much you scroll down or up, because it's relative to a fixed point in the browser's window. Float property allows you to place elements in normal flow as far to the left or right of the containing element as possible. Like in this example, understanding float property will give you a good understanding of modern frameworks and technologies used for defining layouts. It's like knowing the how-to of a magic trick. I'll leave the links in the bibliography. CSS allows you to arrange and organize the HTML elements. That is called a layout. That's called a layout. You can have a fixed layout or a liquid layout. Look at this GIF to see the difference between them. The first layout is liquid because the elements contract and expand as the screen resolution changes. The second layout is fixed at 960 pixels width. The units in fixed layouts are in pixels, whereas units in liquid ones are usually in percentages. Which layout to choose depends actually on your user target. Both have advantages and disadvantages. When I talked about the grids, I remember a teacher in my drawing class who said, draw a flower, like this one. And after a while, despite my effort, it looked like a scribble. Then he told me to do it again, this time using a grid. And voila, much easier, much faster, and I felt like an artist. So kind of the same holds for the web. You can be much more productive and organized if you choose a predefined grid, so that you can arrange your elements accordingly. In this grid here, a square is an individual cell. Then you could say we talk about a 6-column grid. The space on the outside of the grid is called margin, and the space between the columns is called gap or gutter. Using a grid might look like a restriction in design, but in reality it gives you the ability of composing web designs in a very consistent way. And that brings us to media queries, which basically allows us to apply specific CSS rules, depending on a condition related to the device on which the content is being used. What you find on the parentheses is called the media feature expression, which tests against a value about the browser, output device, or environment. In the example, we have different designs for small, medium, large, and extra large devices. Using this approach, you guarantee a consistent design in most devices. Finally, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Ingenious developers and designers have already invented solutions to make you more productive as a web developer. An example is one of the most popular CSS frameworks out there called Bootstrap, made by Twitter. As a matter of fact, the previous media queries you saw are part of the Bootstrap framework. So go ahead and play around with it. You're allowed to already use it during this course. And that was it. Here I leave the bibliography, some bibliography, and links for you to go in depth and practice a little. Thank you very much. See you in the next lecture.